Hi. There are so many things to talk about with this particular play, but I wanted to do a couple of quick things. One of them is to give you a brief summary of the play. As Nelson mentioned, there are love quadrangles, there are love octagons. I was trying to list them earlier for the introduction to the published version, which we're going to be selling in the Tudor Guild shop.
Yeah.
And I kept counting them, and I started feeling kind of silly as I kept listing them out. But anyway, it's, as he mentioned, there are a lot of kind of subplots. But essentially, it's the story of a mother who's a famous actress, her son who's an aspiring writer, and the very successful writer with whom the famous actress has an affair. Meanwhile, the aspiring writer has a girlfriend who's local. As soon as she meets this more successful writer, things start to kind of unravel from there. So it really is a story about the conflict between generations, between which kind of art is more truthful, and ultimately it was a play that very much reflected the turn of the century in Russia, which we know every turn of every century brings about kind of unusual changes for those of us. Hopefully all of us remember Y2K, but it brings about certain cultural shifts in ways of communicating, ways of art expressing human nature, etc. And the Seagull certainly did that. It was certainly credited as being the birth of modern theater, and that the Seagull was the first successful production put on by the Moscow Art Theater, very famously in 1898. And the Moscow Art Theater is known as having greatly influenced American realism and what we think of today as being good theater or good performance that to some degree reflects truth. And what's interesting is I think truth is reflected in all of these plays, even though they take very, very different forms. Seagull is an example of Chekhov's attempt to reflect that. And as Nelson said, you are in the room with a degree of truth that feels outrageously human, and it's also outrageously funny. And funny in the way that I recognize myself in these characters, the way that we recognize ourselves in these characters, in their failed love affairs, and when they need their pride the most, it gets stripped from them. 5 minutes after they say, if only I could just never see that person again, everything would be fine, that person comes in. That's the humor that's in Chekhov. And so it's deeply funny in a deeply true kind of way. The moment when someone expresses their innermost need, and when they can finally put a voice to it, someone interrupts them with some horrible mundane thing. You know, right when someone's expressing the most joy, their friend comes in and says, oh, did you hear so-and-so died? That's the kind of humor that Chekhov is able to bring. And so in that way that theater can, I think this play kind of speaks to our humanity and to who we are as people. I wanted to ask Louis, can I give a quick rundown of how Russian names work?
Yeah.
Okay, for those of you who have ever read Tolstoy or Dostoevsky or any of those people, you know they have like 25,000 names, right? All right, super quick lesson, which I always do with the cast at the beginning of rehearsals and stuff. All right, our main character in Seagull is Konstantin Gavrilovich Trepyov. That's his name. In Russia, you're given a first name, which Konstantin is the name that his parents gave him. Gavrilovich is his father's name with a gender-appropriate ending. So his father's name was Gavril, so he's Gavrilovich, meaning son of Gavril. Historically, it was a way of identifying people in the same way that I would be Allison Ronaldovna or something because my dad's name is Ronnie. Thank God I'm not that. But so Konstantin Gavrilovich, Konstantin, son of Gavril, and the family name is Trepyov. And so presumably the female version of that would be Trepyova or something like that. Often when something ends with an A in Russian, it's a feminine word or a feminine name. Often when it ends with a consonant, it's a masculine word or name. So we have two siblings in the play, Irina Nikolaevna and Pyotr Nikolaevich. Their father's name was Nikolai, right? So that's a little indicator of relationships when it comes to Russian names in Russian literature. And you also know when someone's family either really liked tradition or they really weren't very creative when someone is named Semyon Semyonovich, right? So not, and Gogol's anti-hero in the overcoat is Akaki Akakievich. So it's a little indicator from the playwright so that you can have a sense of who people are. But that's a super fast version of the Russian names.
But then they all have those nicknames.
They all have nicknames.
I know, yeah. It's the
nickname. Series. First cousin wants to move gets called, fun.
I know, but it's gonna sound the most like what the person's first name is. So Kostya is the nickname for Konstantin. So.
Could you talk a little bit about translating from the Russian to
Yeah, absolutely. A lot of people say, and I agree, there's no way to literally translate something. There's no such thing as a literal translation because to some extent all translation is adaptation. And that's true. I was hired to work on these plays with Libby back in 2004 when we started on Cherry Orchard. And it was specifically because I majored in Russian in undergrad, and I immediately told Louis, but I'm not a native speaker, you need a native speaker. And Louis replied, we want a theater person. And so I said, okay, I guess that is me, actually. I am a dramaturg who happened to speak Russian. And my favorite part of Russian is the linguistics, frankly. And so, so what I created for Libby in this process was I basically compared versions of the Chekhov in the original, made sure that I had a text that I believed hadn't been censored too much at the time period, or at least that the Soviet Union had restored parts to, because all of Chekhov's plays were censored to some extent under the Tsarist regime. So I found the one that seemed like it was going to be the most reflective of what Chekhov would have wanted had the censors not been in his life. And then I went about translating it word by word, and my translations are heavily annotated. So basically, I give Libby as much information about the words that I'm putting on the page as possible. So is it an estate or is it a farm? What's the difference in Russia at the time? What's a dacha? Was a dacha big or was it small? I give her that type of information in the translation that I give her so that she can then make decisions from there. If a word seems to have a lot of synonyms in English, like happy, joyful, cheerful, things like that, I list them, and if the word in Russian has some meaning from the root, because it's a root-based language, then I'll say the word also indicates lucky, which in Russian is счастливый, which is happy. Also, the root of it, счасть, has some degree of luck in it as well. That becomes a word for lucky in other incarnations. So I let her know that, because that's the nerdy part that I like. So, so the poor woman has endured years of that. And at the end, I deliver this kind of document to her, which is essentially a roadmap to the play. She speaks Chekhov and I speak Russian. And so between the two of us, we're able to make it work. And frankly, I've made mistakes in the translation that she caught, not knowing the Russian, but feeling like it didn't quite feel right, which is kind of terrifying and also really humbling and amazing. So that's how well Libby knows Chekhov. So that's a little bit about that.
Thank you. Thank you.